Welcome to this journey through one of Victorian England's most disturbing institutional secrets, buried in the industrial heart of Liverpool for over a century. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will shake your understanding of social care, institutional power, and the thin line between protection and imprisonment in a way few other accounts can. We're about to delve into a mystery that spanned decades within the stone walls of Brownlow Hill Workhouse, where hundreds of children vanished into a system so corrupt that it defied all moral accountability and left a legacy so dark that Liverpool's historians spent generations trying to bury the evidence. Where desperate families seeking help found themselves trapped in a nightmare of bureaucratic cruelty, and where one man's unchecked authority transformed a house of refuge into a chamber of systematic abuse and unexplained deaths. It was the year 1896. Queen Victoria's empire stretched across the globe, Britain ruled the seas, and London celebrated the Diamond Jubilee with unprecedented grandeur. But in the industrial north, in the cramped streets of Liverpool, where factory smoke blotted out the sun and poverty was as common as rain, the situation was catastrophic. The city's workhouses were overflowing with the destitute, the sick, the abandoned, and no one was watching what happened behind those towering walls. To understand what unfolded within Brownlow Hill, you must first understand the world that created it. The Victorian Workhouse system was born from the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, a piece of legislation designed with cold utilitarian logic. The philosophy was simple, brutal, and widely accepted by the comfortable classes. Poverty was a moral failing, and assistance should be so unpleasant that only the truly desperate would seek it. The workhouse was meant to be, in the words of the law's architects, less eligible, less desirable than the worst conditions of independent living outside its walls. Liverpool, by the 1890s, was a city of extremes. As one of Britain's primary ports, it was phenomenally wealthy. Shipbuilding, trade, and industry poured money into the city's merchants and industrialists. Grand buildings lined the waterfront. The docks themselves were engineering marvels. But wealth has a shadow, and Liverpool's shadow was long and deep. In the cramped courts and alleyways behind the prosperous thoroughfares, tens of thousands lived in conditions that shocked even hardened social reformers. Entire families occupied single rooms. Tuberculosis was rampant. Infant mortality rates in some districts exceeded 40%. When breadwinners died, when factories closed, when illness struck, families faced a terrible choice: starvation on the streets or the workhouse. Brownlow Hill Workhouse dominated the skyline of Liverpool's northern district like a prison, and in many ways that's exactly what it was. Built in the 1770s and expanded throughout the 19th century, it was a massive complex of stone and brick, surrounded by high walls, its architecture deliberately designed to intimidate. The building could house over 2,000 souls at capacity, and in the desperate years of the 1890s, it frequently exceeded even that grim number. The institution's official purpose was to provide for the destitute food, shelter, basic medical care in exchange for labor. Men broke stones, women picked oakum until their fingers bled, separating tarred rope fibers used for caulking ships. Children received minimal education and were trained for domestic service or factory work. Families were separated immediately upon entry. Husbands sent to one wing, wives to another, children to a third. Even nursing infants were taken from their mothers after a short time. The theory was that this harsh regime would motivate the poor to find work and leave. The reality was that many who entered found themselves trapped in a system that was remarkably difficult to escape, particularly the children. Picture Brownlow Hill on a November morning in 1896. Fog rolls in from the Mersey, thick and yellow with factory smoke, wrapping the workhouse in an oppressive shroud. The building looms like a Gothic fortress, 3 stories of grimy stone, rows of narrow windows that look more like arrow slits than sources of light, a central block flanked by extensive wings that spread like the arms of a trap closing. The entrance is through a receiving ward, where a clerk sits behind a wooden desk, scarred by decades of desperate hands gripping its edge. Here, the destitute surrender their names, their possessions, their dignity. They sign forms they often cannot read. They submit to inspection hair examined for lice, bodies checked for disease, clothes taken away and replaced with coarse workhouse uniforms. The men's suits are drab gray, shapeless and rough. The women's dresses are equally colorless. The children wear whatever fits, often garments that have clothed dozens before them. Beyond the receiving ward lies a warren of corridors, dormitories, workrooms, and courtyards, all designed according to strict classification principles. The elderly occupy certain wards, separated by sex, the able-bodied adults another section. Children are housed in separate quarters, divided by age and gender. The sick are isolated in an infirmary that smells of carbolic acid and worse things. The insane occupy cells in a wing the other inmates fear to approach, where screaming sometimes echoes through the night. The workhouse operates on a rigid schedule. A bell rings at 5:30 in the morning. Inmates rise from hard beds, wooden frames with thin straw mattresses that do little to soften the slats beneath. They file to communal washrooms where cold water and rough soap await. Breakfast is at 6, thin gruel, a small portion of bread. Then work begins and continues until midday, more bread, perhaps some watery soup. Work resumes until 6 in the evening. Supper, more bread, occasionally a small amount of cheese or bacon on Sundays. Evening prayers in the chapel. Bed by 8. This was the official routine, the one described in the regulations posted in the entrance hall. But behind the facade of administrative order, Brownlow Hill harbored a darker reality, one that would eventually demand a terrible accounting. At the center of our story stands a man whose name appears in the workhouse records thousands of times, signed with a flourish that speaks of absolute authority: Robert Carrington, master of Brownlow Hill Workhouse. Carrington was appointed to his position in 1889, selected by the Board of Guardians, the local officials responsible for administering poor relief, for his experience in institutional management and his reputation for running an efficient, economical operation. He was 42 years old at the time of his appointment, a widower with no children, a man who presented himself as dedicated entirely to his work. Those who met Carrington in official capacities found him impressive. He was tall, impeccably dressed even by Victorian standards, with a carefully groomed beard and piercing gray eyes that seemed to assess and judge simultaneously. He spoke with precision, kept meticulous records, and could recite regulations from memory. The Board of Guardians praised his ability to reduce costs while maintaining order. Visiting dignitaries commented on the cleanliness of the wards they were shown, the apparent discipline of the inmates, the smooth functioning of the institution. But the inmates knew a different man. In the dormitories at night, the children whispered about the master's inspections, how his footsteps in the corridor brought a particular kind of silence, heavy with dread. How certain children would be summoned to his office and return changed, quieter, more withdrawn, or sometimes not return at all to their usual wards. The adults spoke in carefully coded language about the punishment cells in the basement, rooms that appeared in no official floor plan, where inmates could be confined for discipline, with no external oversight. Sarah Henshaw, who entered Brownlow Hill in 1894 with her 3 children after her husband died in a dock accident, would later testify about her first encounter with Master Carrington. She remembered his cold appraisal as she stood in the receiving ward, how his eyes lingered on her 7-year-old daughter Emma with an attention that made Sarah's stomach turn. She remembered trying to protest when they took her children away, and Carrington's quiet voice: "Mrs. Henshaw, you have surrendered your rights by entering this institution. The children are now under my care. Resist, and you will be classified as lunatic and transferred to the asylum wing. Cooperate, and you may see them on Sundays." She cooperated. What choice did she have? The first hints that something was deeply wrong at Brownlow Hill came not from inside the institution, but from the cemetery. Liverpool's burial grounds in the 1890s were overwhelmed. The city's death rate, particularly among the poor, was staggering. But even accounting for this, the number of workhouse burials drew attention. Parish clerks noticed the steady stream of small coffins from Brownlow Hill, child after child, week after week, recorded in the death registers with distressing regularity. The official cause of death was usually mundane: consumption, fever, failure to thrive, heart weakness. Diseases that were tragically common in institutions where nutrition was poor, heating inadequate, and overcrowding constant. But the sheer volume troubled some observers. Dr. Thomas Brennan, a physician who occasionally visited other workhouses in Lancashire, noticed the discrepancy when comparing mortality statistics across institutions in 1895. Brownlow Hill's child mortality rate was nearly double that of comparable workhouses in Manchester and Preston. When Dr. Brennan raised this concern with the Board of Guardians, Master Carrington provided a ready explanation. Brownlow Hill, he noted, received the most desperate cases. Children already weakened by severe poverty, often brought to the workhouse at death's door. The institution did its best with limited resources, but some children arrived too damaged by privation to save. The Guardians accepted this explanation. After all, Carrington's records were impeccable, his administrative efficiency undeniable. But the pattern continued. Inside the workhouse, inmates noticed other things. Children who vanished from the dormitories, their absence explained away with vague references to transfer or adoption or apprenticeship. In that era, workhouse children were frequently sent out as apprentices or domestic servants, often to distant locations, so such explanations seemed plausible. Except the children never wrote home, never sent word, and families who inquired about their whereabouts received only bureaucratic deflection. Margaret Doyle entered Brownlow Hill in 1895 with her 5 children after her husband abandoned the family. Within 3 months, 2 of her children boys, aged 9 and 11, had disappeared. When she demanded answers, she was told they'd been apprenticed to a manufacturer in Bolton and would be well cared for. She asked for the address. She was told that correspondence was not permitted during the training period. She persisted. She was placed in solitary confinement for disruptive behavior, and warned that continued infractions would result in her being judged insane and permanently institutionalized. Margaret stopped asking questions, but she didn't stop noticing. She befriended other mothers in the women's ward, and together, quietly, carefully, they began to compare stories. The pattern was chilling. Certain children, particularly boys between the ages of 8 and 13, were frequently selected for these mysterious apprenticeships or transfers. They were always removed at night, after the evening bell, when most inmates were locked in their dormitories. The selections seemed to follow the master's personal inspections of the children's wards, and some children, before they vanished, exhibited strange changes in behavior. They became withdrawn, refused to speak, developed night terrors. When these traumatized children disappeared, the explanation was often that they'd been sent to special institutions for mental deficiency or moral corruption. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a workhouse porter named William Marsh. Marsh was 63 years old in 196, a former dock worker crippled by an accident who'd been given employment at Brownlow Hill out of charity, or perhaps because someone who was functionally inmate himself would be too frightened to question what he observed. Marsh swept the corridors, tended the coal fires, and performed odd jobs throughout the complex. His humble position meant he was largely invisible, able to move through the institution unnoticed. Marsh was also a man with a conscience that decades of hardship hadn't entirely crushed. On a November night in 1896, Marsh was stoking the furnace in the basement, a massive cast-iron beast that consumed coal constantly and heated the water for the entire complex. The basement was a labyrinth of brick corridors, storage rooms, and mechanical spaces, dimly lit by gas lamps that cast more shadows than light. As Marsh worked, he heard voices echoing through the passages, unusual at this hour, near midnight, when the workhouse should have been silent except for occasional coughs from the sleeping wards. Above, he recognized Master Carrington's precise diction. The other voice was younger, pleading, a child. Marsh froze, the coal shovel still in his hands. The voices grew closer. Then he heard it, a sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A sharp crack, like a tree branch breaking, then silence, then dragging sounds, something heavy being pulled across the floor. The porter pressed himself into the coal bin, hardly daring to breathe. Through a gap in the stacked coal, he watched as Master Carrington emerged into the furnace room, dragging something wrapped in canvas. The master's face was flushed, his breathing labored. He dragged the bundle to a wooden door that led to a disused storage tunnel, a remnant from the workhouse's original construction that had been officially sealed off decades ago. Carrington produced a key, unlocked the door, and dragged the bundle inside. He emerged 15 minutes later, empty, handed, locked the door, and departed. Marsh waited until the master's footsteps had faded entirely. Then, trembling, he approached the wooden door. It was old, thick oak, securely locked, but the lock was rusty, and Marsh had access to the workhouse's maintenance tools. What William Marsh discovered in the sealed tunnel would eventually bring down not just Master Carrington, but would expose systemic failures throughout Liverpool's entire poor relief system. The tunnel was approximately 50 feet long, carved through the bedrock beneath the workhouse. It had been used in the institution's early days to store coal and supplies, but had been deemed unsafe after a partial collapse in the 1840s and officially sealed. Moisture seeped through cracks in the stone walls. The air was thick with the smell of mold and damp earth, and something worse, a sickly sweet odor that made Marsh's throat close. He'd brought a lantern, and its light revealed horrors. Along the walls, hidden in alcoves and crevices, were human remains. Not neatly arranged, not respectfully laid out, but discarded like refuse. Marsh counted 7 distinct bundles, each wrapped in canvas or workhouse blankets, in various states of decomposition. Some were clearly recent, others had been there for months or years, all were children. Marsh, despite his shock, had the presence of mind to understand that disturbing these remains would alert Carrington that his secret had been discovered. Instead, he carefully noted the location of the door, memorized the key he'd used to open it, replaced everything as he'd found it, and began planning how to expose what he'd seen. The difficulty was immense. In Victorian England, workhouse masters held nearly absolute authority within their institutions. The boards of guardians rarely questioned their appointed officials' judgment. Inmates' testimony was routinely dismissed as unreliable. And Marsh was technically an inmate himself. His accusations against Carrington would likely be dismissed as delusion or spite. But Marsh knew someone outside the system, Father Daniel O'Connor, priest at St. Mary's Church in nearby Everton. O'Connor was known for his work with Liverpool's poor, his willingness to challenge authorities, and his reputation for integrity that even Protestant officials respected. On a Sunday morning, when Marsh had permission to attend Mass, he approached Father O'Connor after the service and requested a private meeting. In the priest's study, speaking in a low voice thick with emotion, Marsh revealed everything: the voices in the basement, the dragged bundle, the tunnel full of dead children. Father O'Connor listened without interruption. When Marsh finished, the priest sat in silence for a long moment, his face grave. Then he asked a question that would prove crucial. "Can you show me proof?" What followed was one of the most carefully planned investigations in Liverpool's history, conducted not by police initially, but by a priest and a crippled porter who understood that one mistake would mean the evidence, and possibly their own lives, would disappear. Father O'Connor was no fool. He understood that a direct accusation against Master Carrington would be met with denial, official protection, and the likely destruction of any evidence. Instead, he needed to build an irrefutable case that would force the authorities to act. His first step was to contact Dr. Thomas Brennan, the physician who'd previously questioned Brownlow Hill's mortality statistics. Dr. Brennan, intrigued by O'Connor's carefully worded inquiries about workhouse conditions, agreed to conduct an unofficial investigation into child death rates across Liverpool's institutions. His analysis, completed over several weeks, confirmed the pattern. Brownlow Hill's statistics were not just elevated, but statistically impossible unless something beyond ordinary disease was claiming children's lives. Meanwhile, Father O'Connor began quietly interviewing former workhouse inmates who'd lost track of children within the system. He found Margaret Doyle, Sarah Henshaw, and dozen others women who'd been told their children were apprenticed or transferred, but who'd never received word of their whereabouts. He collected names, dates, physical descriptions. He cross-referenced these with official apprenticeship records that Dr. Brennan was able to access through his medical position. The records didn't match. Children who'd supposedly been apprenticed to specific manufacturers or families had no documentation beyond the initial workhouse notation. When Father O'Connor discreetly contacted some of the listed employers, they had no knowledge of receiving such children. By January 1897, O'Connor had compiled a dossier of 32 children who'd entered Brownlow Hill, been marked as transferred, and effectively vanished from all records. And he had William Marsh's testimony about what lay in the sealed tunnel. It was time to involve the police. Father O'Connor approached Inspector James Thornbury of the Liverpool City Police. Thornbury was a seasoned investigator, a man who'd risen through the ranks on merit despite his working-class origins, and who had a reputation for thoroughness and incorruptibility. When O'Connor presented the dossier and Marsh's account, Thornbury's expression grew increasingly grim. "This is a serious accusation, Father," Thornbury said. "If you're wrong, it will destroy you. If you're right." He paused, considering the implications. "If you're right, this is the biggest scandal Liverpool has seen in generations. Every guardian, every official who should have been overseeing that institution, they'll all be implicated in the failure." "I know," Father O'Connor replied, "but those children deserve justice, and God forgive us if we turn away from this truth because it's inconvenient." Thornbury nodded slowly. "Then we do this properly. We'll need a warrant, witnesses, and we'll need to move fast once we start. If Carrington gets even a hint we're coming, that tunnel will be emptied and sealed before we can reach it." On the morning of February 3, 1897, Inspector Thornbury arrived at Brownlow Hill Workhouse with a warrant, 6 constables, Dr. Brennan and Father O'Connor. The warrant authorized a full inspection of the premises, including all areas normally restricted from public view. Master Carrington met them in the entrance hall, his composure perfect, despite the obvious irregularity of the situation. "Inspector, this is highly unusual. The Board of Guardians should have been notified of any official inspection. This is a criminal investigation, Mr. Carrington, not an administrative review." Thornbury replied calmly, "Will require access to all areas of the institution, including the basement levels." Something flickered in Carrington's eyes. Fear, perhaps, or calculation. "The basements are extensive and largely unused. Storage areas, mechanical spaces. I can assign a porter to guide you. William Marsh will serve as our guide," Thornbury said, and watched Carrington's face carefully. The master's composure cracked for just an instant. His eyes found Marsh, who stood behind the police officers, and the look was murderous. Then the professional mask returned. As you wish, though I must note that Marsh is mentally unreliable. An accident damaged his mind as well as his body, if he's told you stories. Let's see what we find, Mr. Carrington. You're welcome to accompany us. The descent into the basement was like entering another world. The temperature dropped, the air grew thick and damp. Gas lamps cast wavering light on brick walls, stained with moisture and age. Their footsteps echoed in the confined spaces. Marsh led them through the warren of corridors with surprising confidence, past the furnace room, past storage areas stacked with supplies, to a section where the brick walls gave way to older stone construction. Here, in a narrow passage that seemed to lead nowhere, was the wooden door. That door's been sealed for 50 years, Carrington said quickly. It leads to an unsafe area, absolutely nothing of interest there. Then you won't mind us looking, Thornberry replied. Mr. Marsh, open it please. Marsh used the key he'd carefully copied weeks earlier. The lock resisted, then turned with a grinding of rusty metal. The door swung open, and the smell that emerged made several men step back, covering their faces. Thornberry raised his lantern and stepped inside. What he saw in that tunnel would be described in graphic detail during the subsequent trial, recorded by court stenographers whose hands shook as they wrote. For the purposes of respect and decency, we'll summarize. The tunnel contained the remains of 13 children, some recently deceased, others clearly present for years. The cause of death was not disease. The injuries were consistent with violence, blunt force trauma, strangulation, evidence of systematic abuse. Dr. Brennan, who entered after Thornberry, made a quick preliminary examination. His voice, when he emerged, was tight with barely controlled rage. Inspector, these children were murdered, multiple victims over an extended period. This is systematic. Behind them, Master Carrington had gone pale. He turned to run, but the constables were already moving, grabbing his arms, forcing them behind his back. Robert Carrington, Inspector Thornberry's voice rang through the basement. I am arresting you for the murder of these children. You will be held pending formal charges. Carrington said nothing. His face had become a mask, expressionless, as if he'd retreated somewhere deep inside himself where the horror of what he'd done couldn't follow. The arrest of Master Carrington sent shockwaves through Liverpool. Within hours, the story had reached the newspapers. By the next day, crowds surrounded Brownlow Hill Workhouse, some seeking information about missing children, others simply drawn by the morbid spectacle. The police cordoned off the entire basement level as a crime scene. Dr. Brennan and 2 other physicians began the grim work of examining the remains. Each child was photographed, measured, and examined for identifying characteristics. The newer victims still wore scraps of workhouse clothing. Some had physical features, dental work, healed fractures, birthmarks, that could potentially be matched to records. The identification process was heartbreaking. Father O'Connor brought forward the mothers he'd interviewed, and one by one, they were asked to view items recovered from the tunnel: a shoe, a piece of clothing, a description of hair color, and approximate age. Margaret Doyle identified her son Thomas by a distinctive scar on what remained of his left wrist, where he'd been burned by a cook fire years earlier. Sarah Henshaw recognized her daughter Emma by the specific pattern of the workhouse dress. She'd mended a tear in it herself the day before Emma was taken. But many children remained unidentified. Some had been in the tunnel for so long that individual identification was impossible. Others had likely entered the workhouse as orphans or abandoned children, with no family to claim them or even report them missing. Inspector Thornberry expanded the investigation beyond the physical evidence. He obtained a court order to seize all of Brownlow Hill's administrative records, admission logs, transfer documents, death certificates, apprenticeship contracts. A team of clerks began the massive task of cross-referencing every child who'd entered the institution during Carrington's tenure with their documented outcomes. The results were damning. Of the 847 children who'd been admitted to Brownlow Hill between 1889 and 1897, 213 were listed as having been transferred or apprenticed with minimal documentation. Following up on these cases revealed that roughly 140 of those children could be accounted for legitimate apprenticeships, transfers to other institutions, adoptions. But 73 children had simply vanished from all records after being marked as transferred. The remains in the tunnel accounted for only 13 of these missing children. Where were the other 60? Master Carrington, held in Liverpool's Walton jail pending trial, refused to speak. Not to the police, not to the magistrate during preliminary hearings, not even to the solicitor appointed to represent him. He sat in his cell, ate mechanically when food was provided, and stared at the wall in silence. This silence frustrated investigators who hoped a confession might reveal the fate of the other missing children. But it also, perversely, made the case against him more straightforward. His lack of explanation for the bodies in the tunnel, combined with his position of absolute authority over the workhouse and the testimony of witnesses who'd seen him in the basement with children, who subsequently vanished, created a clear narrative of guilt. Meanwhile, the investigation into institutional oversight revealed layers of negligence that bordered on complicity. The Board of Guardians, responsible for supervising workhouse operations, had conducted only cursory inspections during Carrington's tenure. Multiple guardians testified that they'd accepted Carrington's reports without verification, impressed by his administrative efficiency and cost savings. He ran the workhouse under budget, one guardian admitted during questioning. In an era when every institution was struggling with overcrowding, he maintained order and reduced expenditures. We saw no reason to question his methods. But some questions had been asked and ignored. Records revealed that 3 different physicians who'd occasionally visited Brownlow Hill had submitted reports noting concerns about child welfare, unexplained injuries, and the unusually high mortality rate. These reports had been filed away and never investigated. One physician, Dr. Edward Morrison, testified that when he'd pressed the Board of Guardians to investigate specific cases of suspicious injuries in 1894, he'd been told that his services were no longer required and his access to the workhouse was revoked. The institutional protection of Carrington began to look less like innocent negligence and more like willful blindness, a desire to avoid scandal and maintain the comfortable fiction that the poor relief system was functioning adequately. As the trial date approached, more witnesses emerged, each adding pieces to the horrifying mosaic of life under Master Carrington's rule. Elizabeth Ward, who'd worked as a nurse in the workhouse infirmary from 1892 to 1895, described a culture of fear and silence. We were told never to question the master's orders. If a child was removed from the infirmary and didn't return, we were to assume they'd been transferred to another facility. If we asked questions, we were threatened with dismissal. She recalled specific incidents that haunted her. A boy of 10 who'd developed an infection after sustaining mysterious bruises across his back and shoulders. He told me the master had beaten him for being insolent. When I reported this to the senior physician, I was told that corporal punishment was within the master's authority and I should concern myself with medical matters only. The boy disappeared from the infirmary 3 days later. I was told he'd been sent to a convalescent home in the countryside. Thomas Fletcher, a former workhouse schoolmaster who'd been dismissed in 1894, testified that he'd been fired specifically for protesting Carrington's treatment of children. I witnessed him strike a girl across the face with such force that she fell and struck her head on the floor. When I objected, he told me that discipline was his domain, not mine. I reported the incident to the board. 2 weeks later, I was dismissed for inadequate teaching standards. The children themselves, those who'd survived their time at Brownlow Hill, provided the most disturbing testimony. Because of their age and the traumatic nature of their experiences, their testimony was given in closed sessions, but court officials leaked general details to the press. Multiple children described nocturnal visits from the master, being summoned to his office after evening prayers, being taken to the basement under various pretexts. They described physical abuse, psychological torment, and a systematic pattern of selecting certain children, usually those who had no family inquiring about them, or those who'd shown defiance or attempted to complain about conditions. One 15-year-old boy, who'd been at Brownlow Hill from age 9 to 14, described Carrington's method with chilling precision. He would choose boys who had no visitors, or whose family had died. He would be kind at first, give us extra food, speak gently. Then he would ask us to do small tasks for him, carry messages, clean his office. Then the tasks would become stranger. He'd ask us to come to the basement late at night, say there was work to be done. Once we were down there, away from everyone, he became a different person. The boy's testimony was cut short when he broke down sobbing, unable to continue. But the pattern was clear. Carrington had been a predator who used his institutional power to identify vulnerable children, isolate them, abuse them, and ultimately kill those who threatened to expose him or who he'd simply tired of. The trial of Robert Carrington opened at Liverpool Assizes on May 4, 1897, before Justice Sir William Markham. The courtroom was packed with spectators, journalists, and family members of the missing children. Armed guards surrounded the courthouse, necessary to protect Carrington from mob violence. Public rage against him had reached such heights that credible death threats were received daily. Carrington entered the dock dressed in a plain gray suit, his beard neatly trimmed, his expression still blank. He stood accused of 13 counts of murder, one for each child whose remains had been positively identified. The prosecutor, Sir Charles Pemberton QC, opened with a speech that laid out the evidence with methodical precision. "Gentlemen of the jury," Sir Charles began, "you will hear testimony and see evidence in this trial that will disturb you deeply. You will learn of systematic abuse of power, of predatory behavior masked by respectability, of children who placed their trust in an institution meant to protect them and found instead a monster who used that institution as a hunting ground." The prosecution's case was built on multiple pillars. First, the physical evidence, the remains in the tunnel, the forensic analysis showing cause of death, the items that identified specific victims. Second, testimony establishing Carrington's exclusive access to the tunnel and his presence in the basement with children who subsequently vanished. Third, documentary evidence showing a pattern of unaccounted for children during his tenure. Fourth, testimony from survivors describing abuse and threats. The defense attorney, Mr. Harold Wickham, faced a nearly impossible task. His client refused to speak, the evidence was overwhelming, and public sentiment was violently against him. Wickham's strategy was to focus on reasonable doubt, arguing that while the bodies proved crimes had occurred, they didn't definitively prove Carrington was the perpetrator. "We do not dispute that a horrible crime occurred within Brownlow Hill," Wickham argued. "But this institution housed thousands of people over the years. Many had access to the basement. The porter William Marsh himself knew about the tunnel. Could he not have been responsible? Could not some other employee, some other person, have committed these crimes while Mr. Carrington, perhaps negligently, failed to notice?" But this argument crumbled under the weight of testimony. William Marsh took the stand and described in meticulous detail what he'd seen and heard that November night. Under cross-examination, he remained unshakable. "I saw the master drag that bundle into the tunnel. I saw his face clearly in the lamplight. I heard a child's voice pleading just minutes before. I know what I witnessed. Doctor." Brennan testified about the forensic evidence, the timeline of deaths based on decomposition, the correlation between when specific children were last seen and when they likely died. His testimony established that the killings had occurred throughout Carrington's tenure. stretching back to at least 1890. Margaret Doyle testified about her son's disappearance, her voice breaking as she described her futile attempts to learn his fate. "The master told me Thomas would have opportunities he'd never have in the workhouse. He said I should be grateful. He said only ungrateful mothers question such blessings. I believed him because I had to believe him. If I'd questioned harder, would my boy still be alive?" The prosecution assured her that the guilt lay entirely with Carrington, not with mothers who'd been systematically manipulated and threatened. But the testimony revealed the psychological cruelty of Carrington's scheme, using parents' hopes for their children's futures as a weapon, exploiting their powerlessness, making them complicit. Through their silence, the trial lasted 12 days. The jury deliberated for only 2 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and delivered their verdict with clear, firm voice, guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted. People shouted, wept, embraced. Guards had to restrain some spectators who attempted to rush the dock. Justice Markham hammered his gavel repeatedly, calling for order. When silence finally fell, Justice Markham addressed the prisoner. Carrington stood without visible emotion, his hands clasped before him, his eyes fixed on some point in the distance. "Robert Carrington." Justice Markham's voice was cold with fury barely restrained by judicial decorum. "You have been found guilty of crimes so heinous that they shock the conscience of civilized society. You were given authority over the most vulnerable members of our community, children without families, without protection, without voice. You were trusted to care for them. Instead, you preyed upon them with a cruelty that defies comprehension." The judge paused, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the bench before him. The evidence presented in this court reveals not merely individual acts of violence, but a calculated, sustained campaign of abuse spanning years. You selected your victims with predatory precision. You used institutional power to silence witnesses and eliminate evidence. You transformed a place of refuge into a chamber of horrors. Justice Markham lifted the traditional black cap and placed it upon his head, the ceremonial indication that a death sentence would be pronounced. "Robert Carrington, the sentence of this court is that you be taken from this place to a lawful prison, and from there to a place of execution, where you shall be hanged by the neck until you are dead, and may God have mercy upon your soul, for this court can find none." Carrington showed no reaction. As guards moved to escort him from the dock, he finally spoke, the first words he'd uttered since his arrest 3 months earlier. His voice was quiet but clear in the silent courtroom. "There are more." The words sent a chill through everyone present. Inspector Thornberry, seated in the gallery, immediately stood. Tell us where they are." But Carrington said nothing further. He was led away, and despite intense questioning over the following weeks, he never explained what he'd meant. Were there more bodies hidden elsewhere, more victims beyond those already known, more accomplices who'd helped conceal his crimes? The answer went with him to the grave. Carrington's conviction, far from ending the matter, opened new investigations that would continue for years. The Board of Guardians was dissolved immediately, and a special commission was appointed by Parliament to investigate not just Brownlow Hill, but workhouse oversight throughout England. The Commission's report, published in 1898, revealed systemic failures across the nation, insufficient inspections, inadequate record keeping, minimal accountability, and a culture that prioritized cost reduction over human welfare. At Brownlow Hill itself, authorities conducted a comprehensive search of the entire complex. They excavated areas of the basement that had been bricked up, explored unused wings, examined every sealed room and forgotten space. They found additional evidence of abuse: punishment cells fitted with restraints, rooms with locks only on the outside, a disturbing collection of children's belongings hidden in Carrington's private quarters, but they found no more bodies within the workhouse itself. The search expanded to other locations. Carrington had occasionally traveled on workhouse business, ostensibly to inspect potential apprenticeship sites or escort transferred inmates. Police investigated each known journey, searching abandoned buildings, isolated areas, anywhere he might have concealed additional victims. In June 1897, a grim discovery was made in Toxteth Park, a partially wooded area on Liverpool's southern edge. A groundskeeper, clearing an overgrown section near an abandoned gardener's cottage, found skeletal remains buried in a shallow grave. Forensic examination suggested a child, approximately 9 to 11 years old, buried roughly 5 years earlier. Records showed that Carrington had visited Toxteth Park twice in 1892, claiming to inspect it as a potential location for workhouse inmates to perform outdoor labor. The cottage had been vacant during that period. While the evidence was circumstantial, investigators believed this might be one of Carrington's victims killed elsewhere, then transported and buried during these visits. 2 more possible burial sites were discovered over the following months, one in Everton, another near the docks. Each contained the remains of children whose deaths roughly corresponded to the time frame of Carrington's tenure. Each was in a location he'd been known to visit, but definitive proof linking these remains to Carrington was impossible to establish. The most haunting discovery came from the records themselves. A clerk, painstakingly reviewing admission logs against death and transfer certificates, found an anomaly. Between 1889 and 1897, precisely 91 children had been admitted to Brownlow Hill and then simply vanished from all official documentation, no death certificate, no transfer record, no apprenticeship contract. They'd entered the workhouse and ceased to exist on paper. Some of these children might have been released to family members without proper documentation record. Keeping in the 1890s was often haphazard. Some might have died and been buried in unmarked graves during administrative oversights. Some might have run away and survived elsewhere. But the number was staggering, and the possibility that Carrington had been responsible for more deaths than anyone initially imagined became increasingly plausible. Inspector Thornberry spent years following leads, interviewing witnesses, and attempting to account for each missing child. He would later write in his memoirs that the Carrington case haunted him until his death in 1921, particularly those words uttered in the courtroom, "There are more." Robert Carrington was hanged at Walton Jail on July 15, 1897 at 8:00 in the morning. Approximately 500 people gathered outside the prison walls, waiting in silence for the black flag to be raised indicating the execution had been carried out. The execution was performed by James Billington, England's chief executioner, a man who'd carried out hundreds of hangings with professional efficiency. Even Billington, however, would later describe Carrington as one of the most disturbing prisoners he'd ever encountered. He was completely calm, Billington recalled in an interview years later. Most condemned men show some emotion: fear, remorse, anger, resignation. Carrington showed nothing. He walked to the scaffold without assistance, stood on the trapdoor, and when I asked if he had any final words, he simply shook his head. His eyes were empty, as if the person inside had already left. Father O'Connor had attempted to visit Carrington in his final days, hoping to extract some final confession or information about the other missing children. Carrington refused all spiritual counsel. He would not speak with priests, ministers, or any religious figures. When Father O'Connor finally gained entry to his cell through special permission, Carrington turned his face to the wall and remained silent throughout the priest's prayers and appeals. I told him that confession could bring peace, that revealing the truth about the other children could bring closure to grieving families, Father O'Connor later recounted. I told him that God's mercy was infinite, but required repentance. He never responded, not one word. It was as if he'd chosen to leave this world with his secrets intact, perhaps the only thing he felt he could still control. The hanging itself was reportedly swift and professional. Carrington died instantly when the trapdoor opened. his neck broken cleanly by the calculated drop. His body was left hanging for the prescribed hour, then cut down and buried in an unmarked grave within the prison grounds, as was customary for executed criminals. The Carrington case became a catalyst for widespread reform of England's workhouse system, though change came more slowly than reformers hoped. The Workhouse Inquiry Commission of 198 made dozens of recommendations, mandatory quarterly inspections by independent medical officers, complete documentation of every inmate admission, transfer, and discharge, with copies filed with multiple authorities, immediate investigation of any facility with mortality rates exceeding established baselines, criminal background investigations for all workhouse masters and senior staff, prohibition of solitary authority requiring multiple officials to authorize transfers, apprenticeships, or disciplinary actions, regular access for clergy and charitable organizations to conduct independent welfare checks, legal representation for inmates who wished to file complaints against institutional officials. Some reforms were implemented relatively quickly. By 1900, most workhouses had improved oversight and more rigorous record keeping. But full implementation across England took decades, hampered by cost concerns, institutional inertia, and resistance from officials who viewed the reforms as implicit criticism of their management. Brownlow Hill Workhouse itself underwent dramatic changes. Master Carrington's successor, appointed after months of careful vetting, implemented immediate reforms. Family separation policies were relaxed, allowing mothers more contact with their children. The punishment cells were demolished, the sealed tunnel was filled with concrete, and the entire basement was renovated with improved lighting and ventilation. The workhouse continued operating until 1930, when it was finally closed as part of broader social reforms that replaced the Victorian poor law system with more humane welfare programs. The building stood vacant for years, then was partially demolished, with remaining sections converted to other uses. Today, only a few walls remain, incorporated into modern structures, a barely visible remnant of a dark chapter in Liverpool's history. Perhaps the most important legacy of the Carrington case was the attention finally paid to those who'd survived their time at Brownlow Hill. Children who'd endured abuse, witnessed horrors, and lived with trauma that Victorian society was ill-equipped to address. Several charitable organizations, shamed by the revelations of institutional failure, established funds to support former Brownlow Hill inmates. Children were relocated to better supervised institutions or, where possible, returned to family members. Those who'd aged out of the system received assistance with housing and employment, small compensation for what they'd endured, but at least an acknowledgement of society's failure to protect them. Some survivors managed to build productive lives despite their trauma. James Wilson, who testified during the trial about his experiences, eventually became a labor organizer and advocate for workers' rights, his childhood suffering fueling a lifelong commitment protecting the vulnerable. Mary Patterson, who'd lost 2 siblings at Brownlow Hill, became a nurse and spent decades caring for children in Liverpool's hospitals, determined that others would receive the compassion she'd been denied, but many never recovered. Depression, alcoholism, and suicide were tragically common among Carrington's surviving victims. Victorian society offered little mental health support, and the stigma of having been a workhouse inmate compounded their struggles. Several survivors ended up in asylums, their minds broken by trauma that was never properly treated. Others simply disappeared into poverty and obscurity, their fates unknown. Margaret Doyle, who'd lost her son Thomas to Carrington's predations, dedicated the rest of her life to workhouse reform. She testified before the Workhouse Inquiry Commission, gave speeches to charitable organizations, and campaigned tirelessly for better oversight and protection for institutionalized children. She died in 1912, aged 53, worn down by years of poverty and grief, but having achieved genuine changes in policy that saved unknown numbers of children from similar fates. William Marsh, the porter whose courage had exposed the crimes, received a small pension from Liverpool's city government and modest donations from grateful citizens. He spent his final years in a cottage provided by Father O'Connor's parish, finally secure after decades of hardship. He died in 1904, taking satisfaction in knowing that his actions had brought a monster to justice. Father O'Connor continued his work with Liverpool's poor until his death in 1918. He never stopped advocating for the vulnerable, and he never stopped asking questions about the children who remained unaccounted for. In his papers, discovered after his death, were notebooks filled with names, dates, and ongoing inquiries, evidence of his persistent effort to give identity and dignity to every victim. Despite decades of investigation, many questions about the full scope of Carrington's crimes remain unanswered. The 91 children who vanished from official records during his tenure represent the most haunting mystery. 13 bodies were found in the tunnel. Several more possible victims were discovered in scattered graves around Liverpool. But where were the others? Had they truly been killed, or had some survived, adopted informally by families who never filed proper paperwork, or escaped and built lives elsewhere under different names? Investigators and historians have spent over a century trying to account for each missing child. Some leads proved fruitful records discovered in distant counties showing apprenticeships that had simply never been properly documented. Former inmates traced to other institutions or discovered to have emigrated, but many names on that list of 91 remain matched to no fate, no grave, no conclusion. Carrington's cryptic final words, "There are more," have been interpreted in multiple ways. More victims, more burial sites, more people involved in the crimes. Did he act entirely alone, or were there accomplices who escaped justice? Several staff members at Brownlow Hill during his tenure left Liverpool shortly after his arrest, raising suspicions that they might have been complicit or at least aware of what was occurring. But no additional charges were ever filed. Some historians believe Carrington was part of a broader network of predators who exploited institutional positions to abuse and kill vulnerable children. Evidence exists of similar, though less extensive, crimes at other Victorian institutions. The inadequate oversight, the powerlessness of inmates, the societal indifference to the poor, these created conditions where such predators could operate with relative impunity. Others argue that Carrington was a singular monster, an aberration rather than a symptom of systemic evil. They point to the fact that most workhouse masters, despite operating under the same flawed system, didn't commit murder. Carrington's crimes were his own, enabled by circumstances, but not caused by them. The truth likely lies somewhere between these interpretations. Carrington was individually responsible for his actions, but the system that granted him unchecked power over vulnerable children, that ignored warning signs, that prioritized economy over humanity, created the opportunity for his crimes. The Carrington case remains relevant not merely as historical horror, but as a cautionary tale that echoes through modern institutional failures. Throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, scandals have periodically exposed abuse within institutions meant to care for vulnerable populations, orphanages, juvenile detention centers, care homes, psychiatric facilities. The specific circumstances differ, but the pattern remains disturbingly familiar. Positions of power over the powerless, inadequate oversight, systemic reluctance to believe accusations from those with low social status, prioritization of institutional reputation over victim protection. The case also illuminates Victorian attitudes toward poverty and suffering that, while hopefully diminished, haven't entirely vanished. The notion that the poor were somehow morally deficient, that assistance should be deliberately unpleasant to discourage dependency, that those seeking help had surrendered their rights and dignity, these ideas shaped the workhouse system and enabled horrors like Carrington's crimes. Modern social workers, child protection advocates, and institutional reformers often study the Carrington case as an extreme example of what can happen when society fails to adequately protect its most vulnerable members. The reforms that followed his conviction, mandatory inspections, documentation requirements, independent oversight, legal protections for complainants, established principles that remain central to institutional safeguarding today, but vigilance remains necessary. Every few years, another scandal emerges: a care home where elderly residents were neglected, a juvenile facility where staff committed abuse, an institution where systematic failures allowed harm to continue unchecked. Each new revelation demonstrates that the conditions which enabled Carrington power imbalances, inadequate oversight, societal indifference, require constant attention to prevent. Today, little physical evidence of Brownlow Hill Workhouse remains. The main structure was demolished in stages between 1930 and 1950. Modern buildings now occupy most of the site: apartment complexes, offices, shops, with no indication of the dark history beneath their foundations. A small section of the original workhouse wall still stands on Brownlow Hill Street, now integrated into a modern building facade. Few passers-by notice it, and fewer still know its significance. The tunnel where 13 children were found has been permanently sealed, its entrance obliterated during redevelopment, the underground space filled with concrete and forgotten. Liverpool's municipal archives contain the Carrington trial transcripts, investigation reports, and photographs, grim documentation preserved for historical research. These materials are accessible to scholars, but remain disturbing to examine. The photographs of the tunnel, the remains, the evidence presented in court. These images are difficult to view even over a century later, visceral reminders of real children who suffered real horrors. Local historians occasionally give tours of Liverpool's darker history, and Brownlow Hill features prominently. Standing where the workhouse once loomed, guides describe its architecture, its purpose, and inevitably the Carrington crimes. Tour participants often fall silent when hearing the details, trying to reconcile the ordinary modern street with the extraordinary evil that once occurred there. Some claim the site is haunted: reports of children's voices heard late at night, shadows moving in windows of buildings that stand where the workhouse children's wards once were, an inexplicable sense of sadness or oppression in certain locations. Whether these reports reflect genuine supernatural phenomena or are simply psychological projections of knowledge about the site's history is, of course, impossible to verify. But they persist, generation after generation, keeping the memory of what happened there alive. For many years, there was no memorial to Carrington's victims. Their names appeared in court records and death certificates, but no public monument acknowledged their suffering or honored their memory. In 2012, Father O'Connor's great-grandniece, a Liverpool councilwoman, championed an effort to create a memorial. After years of planning and fundraising, a small garden was dedicated in 2017 in a park near the former workhouse site. At its center stands a bronze statue of a child, arms outstretched, face turned upward as if seeking light. The plaque reads, "In memory of the children who suffered and died at Brownlow Hill Workhouse, 1008, 188-1897. May their forgotten names be remembered with compassion. May their suffering demand our vigilance. May history's failures guide our present commitment to protect the vulnerable." The names of the 13 identified victims are engraved around the statue's base: Thomas Doyle, Emma Henshaw, William Clark, Robert Murphy, Catherine O'Brien, James Fletcher, Mary Thompson, John Wilson, Elizabeth Davis, Michael Ryan, Sarah Brown, Patrick Kelly, and Ann Miller. 13 children who might have lived full lives, who might have had children of their own, whose descendants might walk the streets of Liverpool today had they not encountered a predator in a position of absolute power. For the unnamed victims, those whose remains couldn't be identified, those whose bodies were never found, those 91 children who entered Brownlow Hill and vanished from history. There is only the phrase, and for all those whose names are known only to God. The memorial has become a place of quiet reflection. Visitors leave flowers, small toys, handwritten notes. On the anniversary of Carrington's execution each July, a small ceremony is held, attended by descendants of survivors, historians, social workers, and anyone who believes that remembering such darkness is necessary to prevent its return. The story of Robert Carrington and Brownlow Hill Workhouse remains a disturbing reminder that institutional evil doesn't require vast conspiracies or elaborate systems. Sometimes it requires only one person with power, positioned to exploit the vulnerable, operating within a system too indifferent or incompetent to stop them. But the story also demonstrates that exposure and justice, however delayed, are possible. William Marsh could have stayed silent, too frightened of the consequences to reveal what he'd seen. Father O'Connor could have accepted official explanations and avoided the personal risk of challenging powerful institutions. Inspector Thornbury could have dismissed the accusations as unlikely. The jury could have accepted the defense's arguments about reasonable doubt. Instead, ordinary people chose to act with extraordinary courage. A crippled porter risked his life to expose truth. A priest risked his reputation to demand justice. A police inspector pursued evidence wherever it led, regardless of the powerful people it implicated. And because of their courage, a monster was stopped, children were saved, and reforms were implemented that protected countless others. The Carrington case teaches us that vigilance is not optional. Institutions that hold power over vulnerable populations, whether workhouses, prisons, care homes, detention centers, or any facility where power imbalances exist, require constant oversight. Transparency and accountability. The moment we assume that it couldn't happen here, or those officials wouldn't do such things, is the moment we create conditions for it to happen again. It teaches us that complaints from the powerless must be taken seriously. How many mothers at Brownlow Hill raised concerns that were dismissed? How many children tried to report abuse and were punished for speaking? How many warning signs were visible to anyone willing to look? Systematic abuse persists when systems protect the powerful and ignore the vulnerable. It teaches us that cost efficiency cannot be the primary measure of institutional success. The Board of Guardians praised Carrington because he ran Brownlow Hill under budget, never questioning what corners were being cut or what costs were being paid in suffering rather than currency. Human institutions must be judged by their humanity, not merely their economy. And finally, it teaches us that the past isn't truly past. The children who died at Brownlow Hill are gone, but the circumstances that enabled their deaths, power without accountability, indifference to suffering, systemic failure to protect the vulnerable, these remain present in varying forms. Every generation must choose whether to perpetuate such systems or to tear them down and build something better. The story of Robert Carrington and the Brownlow Hill Workhouse remains etched in Liverpool's collective memory, a wound that never fully healed because it shouldn't heal. Some horrors must be remembered precisely because they're horrible, but questions still linger in the fog that rolls in from the Mersey on cold November nights. Where are the other children? What did Carrington mean when he said there are more? Did accomplices escape justice? Are there burial sites yet undiscovered, forgotten graves holding small bones that once were children with names, families, hopes? To this day, Liverpool residents occasionally report finding artifacts from the workhouse era during construction projects. Bits of pottery marked with the institution's name, buttons from workhouse, uniforms, scraps of documents. Each discovery prompts the question, what else remains buried? What other secrets does the earth hold? And on certain nights, particularly in late autumn when darkness comes early and the city's usual noise seems muted, people walking near the old workhouse site report an inexplicable sense of sadness of presence, as if the past refuses to stay buried. Residents of apartments built on the site's footprint sometimes mention children's voices in dreams, shadows that move in periphery of vision, an atmosphere of melancholy that seems to emanate from the walls themselves. Whether these experiences reflect genuine supernatural phenomena or simply the psychological weight of knowing what occurred on that ground, they serve a purpose. They keep the memory alive. They ensure that the children of Brownlow Hill are not forgotten, that their suffering continues to bear witness, that their deaths demand our continuing vigilance. Because the greatest tragedy would not be the horror of what Robert Carrington did, terrible though it was. The greatest tragedy would be forgetting that it happened, forgetting the systemic failures that enabled it, forgetting the lessons purchased at such terrible cost. Those 13 named children, those unidentified victims, those 90, one who vanished, they deserve more than our horror. They deserve our remembrance, our commitment to protecting the vulnerable, our refusal to ever again allow institutions to operate without accountability. If this journey through one of Victorian England's darkest institutional failures has resonated with you, if you find yourself reflecting on how easily power can corrupt and how essential oversight and accountability remain in any era, then consider subscribing to this channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told, mysteries buried in time not merely to satisfy morbid curiosity, but to extract meaning from tragedy, to learn from history's failures, and to honor those who suffered by ensuring their suffering teaches something to the living. Leave a like if this account has provoked reflections that go beyond mere entertainment, if it's made you think about institutional power, about the importance of protecting the vulnerable, about the courage required to speak truth in the face of authority, and comment sharing your thoughts. How do we ensure such horrors never repeat? What can modern society learn from the Carrington case? What responsibilities do we bear toward the powerless in our own era? The past speaks to us across the years, not in the whispers and shadows that some claim to experience near the old workhouse site, but in the documented evidence of what human beings can do to one another when power goes unchecked, and what other human beings can achieve when they refuse to stay silent in the face of evil. Until next time, remember that the stories we choose to tell, the histories we choose to remember, shape the world we choose to build. The children of Brownlow Hill deserve their place in that memory.